So as you know, George Floyd has been killed by a police officer, and this triggered a series of protests in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think the protest will go on? And is this a social reaction or is it a warning for President Trump?
Mm-hmm. I think that the protests will last for some time. I mean, maybe not months, but for some weeks. But I think the violence is going way down now, thank goodness. And in fact, we saw just overnight the level of violence decrease dramatically. But the feelings that were unleashed by the murder of Mr. Floyd by a policeman on film, those are so deep, so severe, and have been, they reflect a sense of injustice among African Americans and other, we say, people of color, that I think the protest shouldn't go away until, of course, until there's some semblance, some sense of justice for these people, for these racial minorities in the United States. So I think a Pandora's box has been opened, in other words. And the fact that these protests are continuing even at this moment of the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, shows how strongly these people feel about this. So this is a social issue, as your question suggests, a deep social issue that reflects injustices that began with the foundation of the United States. We had slavery in the beginning, and African Americans rightfully feel they've never achieved the same level of welfare overall as whites. This includes their income level, their health care. In fact, they suffer disproportionately more from COVID-19 than white people because of their lower income levels. They don't have as good diet then, they don't have as good health care, and they have other diseases altogether. So that's a big social problem. This is, however, a huge political warning for President Trump. There's a lot of emotion that's coming out now in these protests. A lot of it is what I just talked about, the social and racial injustice. A lot of it is a sense that President Trump has utterly failed to lead on fighting COVID-19. And so his credibility is gone in all of the electorate of the United States, except for maybe 35 to 40% of his voters who will always vote for him no matter what. But what he did 2 days ago, I think, is damaging him with much of his support base as well, and his fellow Republicans, which was he was giving a speech in the White House saying that the states need to bring in National Guard, which are militias that are run by the states. If they don't restore order, he will send in the U.S. military. That is a hugely controversial thing. It's only happened a couple of times in U.S. history. But the real problem, the real warning for him, was that right after he gave that talk, the police used force, shot rubber bullets at peaceful protesters, used gas, flash mini bombs. Nobody was seriously hurt, but he used force and violence to move peaceful protesters back to do what? So that he could walk over to a church, hold up a Bible, not even open it, not read from it. He used it as a prop, a political prop, in front of the church to make it look like he's, I guess, a good Christian. He has been attacked by religious leaders in the United States, Christian and otherwise, by fellow Republicans in the Senate, and by all sorts of former military and national security people who had jobs like I have, who find this to be a real turning point. And it gives a feel that the United States social fabric is unraveling. And I think this is a big wake-up call for him because if he continues behaving like this rather than leading, it's going to be very difficult for him to get reelected. Yes to both of those questions, which go a long way to explaining why the U.S. became the epicenter. Number one, President Trump was very late to recognize this as a serious threat, as a pandemic. He initially said, it's like the flu, it's going to go away miraculously when the weather gets warmer in April. He said, we've got it totally under control, and so he was denying it. There are great news accounts in the Washington Post and elsewhere that talk about how he heard some briefings from his scientific experts saying that if the U.S. continued on that path, up to 2 million Americans could die. And apparently that really got his attention, and he woke up suddenly and he said, this is a pandemic. But I'm not going to take responsibility. It's the individual states and their leaders, the governors, that need to get organized. They need to buy the testing kits and conduct the testing programs to figure out who's sick and who's healthy. They need themselves to buy all the protective equipment that the healthcare people need to stay safe. And he said repeatedly, I am not responsible. So if you don't have a national leader who wants to lead, you can't have a national plan, unlike Turkey, which has had strong leadership and an effective plan. If you don't have a plan, there are going to be many more cases of infection and death. And I know from my own business how, or my business experience, I should say, how terribly the states, each individual state is fighting the neighboring states to try to get enough equipment on the open market. They really need help from the federal government, and that lack of help made the pandemic, made it worse. And I'd just like to say one more thing about the plan. I mean, I think Turkey provided a model for how the U.S. should have done it. Turkey had a strategic plan for how to fight a pandemic. Turkey stuck to that plan and was able to implement that plan without shutting down the entire economy, as we know, right? The people who are most vulnerable were isolated, still are, people 65 years and older. The ones who were the most likely to carry the virus and infect those older people, the younger people under 21, who often you can't tell are sick, they've been isolated as well, which was a smart step, a limited step. And then he had limited lockdowns over the course of several weekends. And then travel restrictions that allowed goods to move around. It allowed some businesses to remain open, didn't shut everything down, but did a great job in turning around the situation here from where a couple months ago Turkey had the fastest rate of infection in the entire world, #1, a dubious distinction, now to being one of the best performers. The U.S. needed a plan like that. To have a plan like that, you need to have a leader who knows it's time to lead.
After this pandemic, what will happen to China and U.S. relationship? And what would be the U.S. move on the Hong Kong issue?
Yeah. U.S.-Chinese relations are terrible, and they just got worse because of China's move on Hong Kong in changing the security law and imposing the Chinese security law, which effectively seems to end Hong Kong's special status. President Trump has responded by threatening a series of sanctions. He's threatened to withdraw Hong Kong's special trading status. That's bad for China because China, as one analyst put it, uses Hong Kong as an ATM, as a cash machine, if you will, from the rest of the world. So China doesn't want Hong Kong to lose its trading status. So President Trump threatened a whole series of serious measures in response against the Chinese government. But it turns out he didn't implement the toughest ones. And as a result, while the stock market crashed when he was announcing he's going to be tough on China because of what it did in Hong Kong, when he imposed softer measures, then actually stock markets rebounded late last week. So he talked tough, but he didn't go as far as he threatened. And why is that? I think that's because President Trump, he wants to look like he's tough on China, but he doesn't want to go too far because he actually admires President Xi Jinping of China. He knows China has the second largest economy in the world, so trade is really important for the U.S. with China, and he wants a trade deal, a trading agreement with China, and China and the U.S. had been making some real progress on that since the beginning of the year. They agreed on a so-called Phase 1 trade agreement. So he wants to be tough on China, but he doesn't want to burn his bridges. But I think that U.S.-China relations are going to get worse now as we head toward the election in November because President Trump has decided that he needs to blame China for COVID-19. He needs to deflect the blame from his own failure to respond, and now deflect the blame from his domestic crisis, the crisis of all these protests in the streets, his not showing leadership, and the U.S. economy drifting certainly into a deep recession, if not a depression. So he and his Republican allies are going to blame China all the way through this. This makes China angry, and the Chinese come back and blame the U.S. supposedly for the coronavirus. So things are going to continue to get worse, but I don't think there's going to be a full break. I don't expect there to be anything like military conflict, despite all kinds of tension between China and the U.S. in the South China Sea. I think it'll be tense and rocky, but I think Trump wants to find a way to come back together with China after the election.
So oil prices dropped due to COVID-19. What changes will there be in oil prices as many countries enter the normalization process?
Yeah, so oil prices dropped because demand dropped, right? Because economies shut down. And as you know, there was a case in the United States where at the peak of the pandemic, because economic growth had dropped so much, oil was piling up in storage all around the world, in oil tankers and in storage tanks. And in the United States on one day, there was no more storage. And so people actually, oil producers had to pay the buyers to take the oil off their hands so that the oil companies could keep producing. I think we're past that now, and we're seeing the oil price start to go back up because economies are opening back up, which means demand is increasing. So as of today and yesterday, oil has broken the $40 limit barrier again in Europe. So that's getting oil back to close to where it was early on in the pandemic, and even closer to prices at the start of the year. So I think oil prices are going to stay low until we see that there's sustained opening of societies, which means that the COVID-19 disease has been defeated, that the virus has been defeated. And nobody knows right now how well we've done. Nobody knows if it's still out there lurking and there'll be a second peak or a third peak and economies will have to close down again. We pray they don't have to. But the oil price is going to follow our success in defeating the new coronavirus. And I think there'll be, it'll take a while for economic growth to return. Most economists say to get back to the pre-COVID-19 levels of economic growth, it'll require maybe 2 years. So oil prices will remain low for the next couple of years, but I think now the chance of oil going back to negative is gone away. So I would say between $40 and $55 is probably, for a while what it's going to stay at.
Okay. How do you think Turkey's success in Libya will change the balances in the country? And the next question is, how do you evaluate Russia's use of mercenaries in Libya?
Yeah, Turkey has been successful in Libya, and I think it deserves to be commended because Turkey was the first country to come out in support of the UN-recognized government, the Government of National Accord. What the warlord or general, if he wants to call him that, Haftar is doing in eastern Libya is treason. Someone, I guess, could call it terrorism, but he's trying to break apart, he's trying to take over Libya. And if he can't do that, I think he wants to break eastern Libya off from western Libya. So Turkey succeeded with its militarized drones, I think, in forcing an end to the last phase of the Libyan civil war and compelling Haftar to seek a ceasefire. Now, Haftar started fighting again in recent days. But the Russian mercenaries left or redeployed, I think, because of Turkey's success. So what comes next depends on whether or not the war resumes or whether or not somebody can step in and arrange for a negotiation between the two sides, which really means Turkey and Russia heading each of their respective groupings. And then somebody needs to maybe broker the agreement. There's nobody willing to do that, so I fear there'll be stalemate dragging on for some time. What Turkey wants is to keep Libya together, right? If Libya stays together, then the maritime agreement that Turkey reached with Libya, which is very important for Turkey's claims to be able to search for oil and gas in the Mediterranean, that agreement will remain. But if eastern Libya breaks off and becomes a new country, then that agreement with the government in Tripoli is no longer valid and Turkey's claims will be even weaker. Already, most countries don't agree with Turkey's claims, but Turkey seems to have staked out its claims and reached an agreement with Libya that is legal, or legally valid. As far as the Russian mercenaries go, this has been a tactic that President Putin has been using increasingly. Having soldiers, Russian military soldiers, but with a different branding. So he first did this in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, where Russian troops came in, occupied those areas. President Putin said, no, those aren't Russian soldiers, those are volunteers. He kept up that fiction for a few months and then finally admitted, no, those were Russian soldiers. Okay. So then he learned maybe there has to be some other cover. There are mercenaries or security companies in the United States, France, UK field those sorts of companies. So I think he decided, okay, we're going to send Russian troops into Syria and then into Libya as part of this company, Wagner. So they're Russian soldiers, but if they get into trouble, President Putin is to claim, no, I have nothing to do with them. So this happened in Deir ez-Zor, Syria, a couple of months ago, where Russian mercenaries from the Wagner group shot at American troops. The Americans responded ferociously, killed several hundred of those Wagner Russian military mercenaries, and President Putin didn't even complain, not even a public statement. Otherwise, had those been regular Russian troops shooting at American troops and the Americans fired back, there'd be a war between Russia and the US. So this tactic allows Putin to use military force in various conflicts, support his proxies, but be able to claim, nope, it's not us, and therefore limit the damage.
With the implementation of Project EastMed, there are claims that this will make the relationship between Turkey and Israel closer. What would you like to say about it?
Well, the EastMed pipeline, first of all, just the one called EastMed, that's a pipeline that's supposed to go from Israel to Cyprus, collect the natural gas from both Israel and Cyprus, take it on to Crete, and then onward to mainland Greece and beyond. That project is ridiculous from a commercial perspective. It makes no commercial sense. It's designed simply to isolate Turkey. And so, by the way, this is a major reason why Turkey wants that maritime agreement with Libya, because if Turkey's exclusive economic zone goes where it goes according to that agreement, then that pipeline, legally at least, can't be built. But Israel is part of that project. So Israel is exerting some leverage on Turkey through the EastMed pipeline. But there's another option that I think Israel does welcome as well. I know because I worked on it. So there's the biggest natural gas field in Israel is called Leviathan. And for full disclosure, I'm on the board of Turkas Petrol. And we were working to encourage, let's say, the development of a pipeline from that Israeli field of Leviathan to Turkey. And we knew, because of our economic calculations, that that route makes the most sense. That is definitely the most commercially logical way to export this gas, and it's something the Israeli government really wanted as well. It wanted to get Turkey-Israel relations back on track after the Mavi Marmara incident and so many other things. Well, that project never got fully realized because of all the political difficulty that remained in Israel-Turkey relations, and of course, the Cyprus negotiations collapsed, and that pipeline would have had to have crossed the exclusive economic zone of Cyprus. That doesn't make it impossible, that just makes such a project more difficult. Well, now I'm picking up in my own business world and my academic world, and even in Daily Sabah I was reading yesterday, that Israel would like to improve its relations with Turkey through business. So again, what we were trying to do with this natural gas pipeline. In this case, Israel is wanting to shift production of the personal protective equipment that's needed to help fight, to protect people during the pandemic, from China to Turkey as much as possible. And this has been beginning to happen. So I think that energy should be a way, or natural gas export should be a way to help Israel and Turkey come closer together. Not only because that makes the most commercial sense, but also because I think Israel realizes that it's safer if it has a positive working relationship with NATO's second largest military, I should say, and a country with which Israel had a strategic partnership.